She thought she was too good for her husband until she followed him one night. Want more stories that feel like they were made just for you? Like, subscribe, and you won't miss a single one. Clara Martinez stood frozen in her marble foyer, her Louboutin heels clicking against the cold stone as she watched her husband through the crack in their bedroom door. Ethan was changing clothes, but not into his usual rumpled khakis and soft cardigan. No, tonight he was pulling on dark jeans that hugged his frame in a way she'd forgotten was possible, sliding into a fitted black sweater that made his shoulders look broader, stronger. His hair, usually messy from running his fingers through it while grading papers, was styled with deliberate care. Who was this man? Clara's heart hammered against her ribs as she pressed herself against the wall, designer clutch trembling in her manicured hands. This was not the Ethan who shuffled around their penthouse apartment in worn slippers, who made her coffee every morning in a mug that read, "World's okayest teacher," who kissed her forehead with the gentle predictability of a man who had never surprised anyone in his life. But here he was, checking his reflection in their bedroom mirror with an intensity that made her stomach flip. There was something in his posture, something confident and purposeful that she hadn't seen in how long? Years? Had it always been there, hiding beneath layers of routine and her own assumptions? "I'll be late tonight," he told her earlier, not looking up from the stack of fifth-grade math tests he was grading at their kitchen island. Parent-teacher conferences ran over. Might be past 11. She'd barely looked up from her laptop, where she was putting the finishing touches on a proposal for the Rothschild penthouse renovation, a project that could change everything for her design firm. She'd murmured, already mentally arranging fabric swatches and marble samples. Now, watching him spray cologne, expensive cologne she didn't recognize, Clara felt the first crack in the foundation of everything she thought she knew. Ethan grabbed keys from the dresser. Not his usual key ring with the tiny apple charm his students had given him, but a sleek set she'd never seen before. As he moved toward the door, Clara caught a glimpse of his face in profile. There was something almost electric about him, an energy that made her pulse quicken in a way it hadn't in months. The front door closed with a soft click, and Clara stood alone in their apartment, surrounded by all the beautiful things she'd collected: the imported Italian furniture, the original artwork, the crystal chandelier that had cost more than most people's cars. Suddenly, all of it felt hollow, like props in a play she'd been performing without realizing it. She should go back to her laptop. The Rothschild proposal was due tomorrow, and landing that client would finally prove to everyone, to herself, that she belonged in the upper echelons of Manhattan society. It would be her ticket to designing for the social elite, to cocktail parties in the Hamptons, to a world where everyone would finally see that Clara Martinez was more than just a schoolteacher's wife. But her feet were already moving toward the window, her breath fogging the glass as she peered down at the street 23 floors below. There, Ethan's familiar figure sliding into a taxi, but nothing about his movements was familiar. He moved with purpose, with something that looked almost like excitement. Clara's reflection stared back at her from the window, 32 years old, stunning in the way that came from good genes and expensive maintenance. Her dark hair fell in perfect waves past her shoulders, her skin glowed from monthly facials, and her figure was maintained by a personal trainer who charged more per session than most people made in a day. She was everything she'd always wanted to be. So why did she feel like she was disappearing? The taxi pulled away from the curb, taillights growing smaller in the distance. Clara pressed her palm against the cool glass, watching her husband, her predictable, simple, ordinary husband, disappear into the night towards some destination she couldn't fathom. Every instinct screamed at her to let it go, to trust him, to go back to her work and her carefully constructed life. But a darker voice whispered questions she'd been trying not to ask for months. When was the last time he'd looked at her the way he'd looked at himself in that mirror? When was the last time she'd felt her heart race when he walked into a room? Clara grabbed her coat and purse, her hands shaking as she called for her own taxi. She told herself she just needed air, needed to get out of the apartment that suddenly felt suffocating. She wasn't following him. She was just going for a drive. But as the elevator descended, carrying her down from her tower of marble and crystal toward the chaotic streets of Manhattan, Clara knew she was lying to herself. She was following her husband into the unknown, and she had no idea what she would find when she caught up with him. The elevator doors opened with a soft ding, and Clara stepped into the lobby, her heels echoing off the polished floors. The doorman tipped his cap, the same respectful nod she received every day. But tonight, nothing felt the same. Tonight, she was about to discover a different man than the one she'd been married for the last years. 3 hours earlier, Clara had been living in what anyone would call a perfect life. The kind of life that looked flawless on Instagram, the kind that made her old college friends comment with envious emojis on every post. But perfection, Clara was learning, could feel a lot like prison. She stood in the marble bathroom of their Upper East Side penthouse, applying her signature red lipstick with the precision of an artist. Tonight was the Morrison Gallery opening, another networking event where she'd smile and charm potential clients while Ethan made polite conversation about lesson plans and school fundraisers. The thought made her stomach tighten with familiar disappointment. "You look beautiful," Ethan said from the doorway, his voice soft with genuine admiration. He always said that. Every time she dressed up, every morning when she rolled out of bed with yesterday's makeup smudged under her eyes, every moment in between. The words used to make her heart flutter. Now they felt like white noise. Clara met his eyes in the mirror. He was still handsome. She'd never stopped seeing that. Those warm brown eyes that had made her weak in the knees when they'd met at a friend's barbecue 7 years ago. The stubble that gave his boyish face just enough edge. The way he leaned against door frames like he had all the time in the world to just watch her exist. But somewhere along the way, she'd started seeing all the ways he didn't fit into the picture she was painting of her life. "Thank you," she replied, turning to check her dress one final time. The black Valentino number had cost more than he made in a month, but he'd never once complained about her spending. He'd just smiled and said she deserved beautiful things, that seeing her happy was worth any price. When had his unconditional support started feeling like a burden instead of a blessing? "I picked up some of those pastries you like from that bakery in Soho," he said, straightening his tie. A simple navy one she'd bought him 2 years ago. "I thought maybe we could have breakfast together tomorrow before I head to school." "It's Saturday, so we could. I have a site visit with the Hendersons at 9. Clara interrupted, not looking at him as she fastened her diamond earrings. "Their Tribeca loft renovation. It's a big job." She saw his face fall in the mirror's reflection, just for a moment, before he recovered with that gentle smile that never quite reached his eyes anymore. "Of course. Maybe Sunday then." Maybe. The word hung between them like a lie they both recognized. There would be another client, another opportunity, another reason to maintain the distance she'd been carefully constructing for months. When had she started treating their marriage like an obligation instead of a choice? They rode to the gallery in relative silence, Ethan's hand resting on her knee in the back seat of the Uber while Clara scrolled through emails on her phone. 3 new inquiries from potential clients, including one from someone claiming to have a referral from the Whitman family. Old Manhattan money with connections that could transform her career. "The Whitman referral," she murmured, excitement quickening her pulse. "Ethan, do you know what this could mean?" He squeezed her knee gently. "Tell me." "They only work with the absolute top tier. If I can land them, it would prove that I belong in their circle. Real society clients, not just Wall Street nouveau riche trying to buy their way in." Ethan was quiet for a long moment. When she finally looked up from her phone, she found him studying her face with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Is that what you want? To belong in their circle?" The question caught her off guard. "Of course. Why wouldn't I want to work with the best clients in the city?" "I didn't ask about the work," he said softly. "I asked about belonging." Clara's chest tightened with irritation. This was exactly the problem. Ethan didn't understand ambition, didn't grasp the importance of building something significant. He was content with his little classroom, his modest salary, his simple pleasures. But she wanted more. She'd always wanted more. "Yes," she said firmly. "I want to belong somewhere that appreciates excellence." Something flickered across his face. Hurt, maybe, or resignation. "And you don't feel like you belong where you are now?" The question was loaded with meaning she didn't want to unpack. Where she was now was married to a public school teacher who wore the same 3 ties in rotation and thought a perfect Friday night was takeout Thai food and a documentary about penguins. Where she was now was constantly explaining why her husband wasn't a lawyer or investment banker or tech entrepreneur like everyone else's at these events. "That's not what I meant," she said, but they both knew it was exactly what she meant. The gallery was already crowded when they arrived, filled with the kind of people Clara desperately wanted to impress. Women in designer dresses discussing their latest acquisitions, men in perfectly tailored suits casually mentioning their art collections and vacation homes. This was the world she belonged in, sophisticated, successful, elevated. And then there was Ethan, shaking hands with a hedge fund manager and asking about his daughter's experience at the private school, where Ethan had briefly taught before switching to public education. The conversation was polite but stilted, filled with the kind of awkward pauses that happened when two people had absolutely nothing in common. Clara watched from across the room as she chatted with Miranda Rothschild about marble sourcing for kitchen countertops. Ethan looked lost among these people, like he was speaking a foreign language he'd never quite mastered. The sight should have filled her with sympathy. Instead, it filled her with shame. "Your husband seems lovely," Miranda said, following Clara's gaze. "What does he do again?" "He's an educator," Clara replied, the euphemism rolling off her tongue like a shield. She'd stopped saying elementary school teacher months ago. How admirable. Public or private? The question hung in the air like a test Clara was failing. "Public," she admitted, hating how small the word sounded. Miranda nodded with the kind of polite smile reserved for people discussing something mildly distasteful. "Well, teachers do such important work. Though I imagine the financial constraints must be challenging." The conversation moved on to safer topics: vacation homes in the Hamptons, upcoming charity galas, the latest scandal involving a social media influencer's interior design disaster. But Clara felt the judgment lingering like smoke in the air. She belonged here, but Ethan didn't. And by extension, maybe she didn't either. When they finally got home that night, Clara was emotionally exhausted from hours of performing, of pretending that the life she'd built was everything she wanted it to be. Ethan helped her out of her heels, his hands gentle on her feet as he'd done 1,000 times before. "You were amazing tonight," he said. "I could see how much they all respected you." The compliment felt like salt in a wound she didn't want to acknowledge. He was proud of her. He was always proud of her. But when was the last time she'd felt proud of him? "Thank you," she whispered, avoiding his eyes. Later, as she lay in bed listening to Ethan's steady breathing beside her, Clara stared at the ceiling and wondered when her perfect life had started feeling so imperfect. When had love started feeling like settling? When had she started believing that being happy with what she had meant she wasn't ambitious enough to deserve more? Clara's hands were shaking as she slid into the back seat of her taxi, giving the driver a destination she'd never heard Ethan mention. An address in Brooklyn that her phone's GPS showed was somewhere in a neighborhood called Bed-Stuy. The unfamiliarity of it made her stomach clench with anxiety and something else she couldn't name. Anticipation, maybe, or dread. "You sure about this address, lady?" the driver asked, glancing at her through the rearview mirror. His eyes took in her designer coat, her expensive handbag, the diamonds glinting at her throat. "It's not exactly your kind of neighborhood." The comment stung more than it should have. What was her kind of neighborhood? The sanitized, wealthy enclave of the Upper East Side where everyone looked and talked and lived exactly the same way? Where the biggest scandal was someone serving the wrong wine at a dinner party? "I'm sure," she said, her voice sharper than intended. As the taxi carried her across the Manhattan Bridge, Clara watched the familiar skyline recede behind her. She'd lived in New York for 8 years, but she realized with growing unease that she'd barely ventured beyond a carefully curated circle of upscale neighborhoods. Brooklyn might as well have been a foreign country. The city outside the windows grew grittier, more alive somehow. Street art covered building walls in explosions of color and anger and beauty. People walked with purpose along sidewalks where actual communities seemed to exist, not just collections of expensive apartments, but places where neighbors knew each other's names, where children played in front of bodegas while their parents chatted in doorways. It was nothing like her world, and it was magnificent in a way that made her chest ache with something she couldn't identify. 20 minutes later, the taxi slowed in front of a modest community center wedged between a laundromat and a corner store advertising fresh produce in Spanish and English. The building was old brick, weathered but well-maintained, with large windows that glowed warm yellow in the darkness. A small sign read, "Riverside Community Arts Center." Clara's pulse hammered as she spotted Ethan's figure through one of those windows. He was standing in what appeared to be a large room filled with folding chairs arranged in a circle. But he wasn't alone. There were maybe 20 people scattered throughout the space, most of them young, many of them Black and Latino, all of them focused intently on something happening at the center of the circle. "You getting out or what?" the driver asked. Clara realized she'd been sitting frozen, staring. Just wait here for a minute, okay? Keep the meter running." She paid him extra to park across the street, then slumped low in the back seat, feeling ridiculous and exposed and desperate all at once. What was she doing? Following her husband like some jealous wife in a bad television movie? But she couldn't look away from that window, couldn't stop trying to make sense of what she was seeing. Ethan was moving around the circle now, and even from a distance, Clara could see that he was completely transformed. Gone was the quiet man who apologized for taking up space at gallery openings. This version of her husband commanded attention, gestured with confidence, sparked reactions from the young people around him. When he spoke, they leaned forward. When he laughed, their faces lit up. Who was this person? "Listen," the driver said, his voice gentler now. "I don't know what kind of situation you got going on here, but maybe you should just go in and talk to whoever you're looking for. Sitting out here in the dark ain't gonna solve nothing." Clara met his eyes in the mirror. He was older, maybe 60, with kind eyes that had probably seen every kind of human drama play out in his back seat. "It's complicated." "It always is, honey. But complicated don't get less complicated by avoiding it." Before she could respond, movement in the window caught her attention. The group inside was shifting, rearranging their chairs to face a makeshift stage area where someone had set up a small microphone. Clara watched in growing amazement as Ethan stepped up to that microphone, his posture straight and confident in a way she'd never seen before. And then he began to speak. Even through the glass, even from across the street, Clara could see the power of whatever words were flowing from her husband's mouth. The audience was completely still, hanging on every syllable. Some of them had their eyes closed, as if they were listening to music. Others were nodding, their faces reflecting recognition or pain or hope. This wasn't the Ethan who graded spelling tests and worried about parent-teacher conferences. This was someone else entirely, someone passionate and powerful and completely, utterly magnetic. Clara's breath fogged the taxi window as she pressed closer, trying desperately to understand what she was witnessing. How long had this been going on? How many nights had he told her about parent meetings or faculty dinners while he was actually here, in this community center in Brooklyn, being this version of himself she'd never known existed? A teenage girl in the audience wiped tears from her eyes. A young man in a hoodie was on his feet, clapping slowly but with obvious emotion. And Ethan, her Ethan, was glowing with the kind of energy Clara hadn't seen in him for years. Maybe had never seen in him at all. "You gonna sit here all night?" the driver asked quietly. Clara realized she was crying. When had that started? The tears were hot on her cheeks, and she wiped them away with the back of her hand, smearing her carefully applied makeup. "I don't know what to do." "What do you want to do?" The question was simple, but the answer felt impossible. What she wanted was to understand. To know who this man was that she'd been sharing a bed with for 5 years. To figure out when she'd stopped seeing him and started seeing only what she thought he lacked. What she wanted was to go back in time and pay attention when it mattered. But what she did was sink lower in the seat and whisper, "Just wait. Please. I need to see what happens next." Through the window, Ethan stepped back from the microphone to thunderous applause. But instead of sitting down, he gestured to someone else in the circle, a young woman who looked nervous but determined as she approached the mic. He stood beside her, not controlling the moment but supporting it, his presence steady and encouraging. Clara watched her husband help that girl find her voice, watched him create space for others to shine, and felt something crack open in her chest. This wasn't just about poetry or performance. This was about leadership, about nurturing, about believing in people enough to help them believe in themselves. When had she stopped believing in him? The evening continued, and Clara found herself transported by what she was witnessing. Person after person took the microphone, teenagers sharing raw poems about growing up in the city, older adults speaking truth about love and loss and survival. And Ethan was the thread that connected them all, the steady presence that made it safe for people to be vulnerable. This was his secret, not an affair or a gambling addiction or any of the other scenarios her suspicious mind had conjured. His secret was that he was remarkable, and somehow, she'd never noticed. As the session began to wind down, Clara realized she was faced with a choice. She could have the driver take her home, pretend this night had never happened, go back to her marble tower and her carefully curated life. She could continue seeing Ethan as the limitation he'd never actually been. Or she could stay. She could try to understand what she'd been missing all along. The taxi's engine idled quietly as Clara made her decision, one that would change everything. Clara returned the next night, and the night after that. What had started as suspicious curiosity had transformed into something else entirely, a desperate need to understand the stranger she'd married. Each evening, she found herself in the same taxi, parked across from the Riverside Community Arts Center, watching through windows that had become her secret portal into a world she'd never known existed. The driver, whose name was Marcus, she'd learned, had stopped asking questions. He simply picked her up at the same corner each night at 8:30, drove her to Brooklyn, and waited patiently while she sat in his back seat, mesmerized by the sight of her husband becoming someone she'd never seen before. "You know," Marcus said on the fourth night, "I've been driving this city for 23 years, and I ain't never seen anyone look at somebody the way you look at that man in there." Clara glanced away from the window, embarrassed to be caught staring. "I'm not." "You are," Marcus said gently. "Question is, why you looking at him from out here instead of in there?" It was a fair question, one Clara had been asking herself for days. The answer was complicated and simple at the same time. She was terrified. Terrified of what it meant that she'd been living with someone for 5 years without really seeing him. Terrified of what it said about her that she'd been so focused on what Ethan wasn't that she'd missed everything he was. "It's complicated," she whispered, her standard response. "Honey, everything worth doing is complicated." Inside the community center, tonight's session was different. Instead of the usual circle of chairs, the space had been rearranged theater-style, with rows of seats facing a small stage. A banner hung across the back wall. Annual Poetry Showcase, Voices Rising. Clara's stomach fluttered with nervous energy as she watched people file into the space. There were more attendees than usual, families, friends, community members of all ages. The atmosphere was electric with anticipation and pride. Ethan appeared from a side room, and Clara's breath caught. He was wearing the same dark jeans and fitted sweater from that first night. But tonight there was something different about his energy. He looked nervous in a way she'd never seen before. Not the gentle anxiety he showed before parent-teacher conferences, but the sharp-edged nervousness of someone about to bare their soul. As the program began, Clara watched local teenagers and adults take the stage one by one, sharing poems about identity, struggle, hope, and resilience. The performances were raw and beautiful, filled with the kind of truth that made her chest ache. These weren't polished presentations. They were pieces of human hearts offered to the world without apology. And throughout it all, Ethan was the steady presence that held it together. He introduced each performer with genuine warmth, celebrating their courage and growth. When a nervous 15-year-old froze halfway through her poem, Ethan stepped quietly onto the stage, not to take over, but to remind her that she was safe, that she was brave, that her words mattered. Clara had never seen him like this, completely in his element, radiating the kind of quiet confidence that comes from knowing your purpose. This wasn't the man who apologized for his career at cocktail parties. This was someone who had found his calling and was living it fully. "Our final performer tonight," Ethan said, stepping up to the microphone as the showcase neared its end, "has something special to share. This piece, well, let's just say it's been a long time coming." The audience settled into expectant silence. Clara leaned forward in the taxi, pressing her face against the cool glass. "This is called Married to a Stranger," Ethan said, his voice carrying clearly through the small space. Clara's world tilted. He began to speak, and the words hit her like physical blows. "I wake up next to someone I used to know. Her face familiar, but her heart a stranger's territory. I remember when she looked at me like I was magic. When my simple dreams felt like enough for two." The poem continued, each line a window into pain Clara hadn't known she was causing. Ethan spoke about loving someone who had grown ashamed of that love, about feeling invisible in his own home, about watching the woman he adored transform into someone who saw him as an obstacle to overcome rather than a partner to cherish. "She collects beautiful things now, art and furniture and connections. But somewhere along the way, she stopped seeing the beauty in ordinary love. in coffee made with careful hands, in someone who thinks she's perfect, even when she can't see past his imperfections. Clara was crying now, ugly tears that she didn't bother to wipe away. Every word was about her, about them, about the distance she'd created between them without even realizing it. But worse than the pain in his words was the love that ran underneath them. Stubborn, enduring love for someone who had stopped loving him back. I teach children that everyone has value. That kindness matters more than status. That being enough is enough. But at home, I'm evidence of dreams too small, a life too simple, a man not worth keeping. The audience was completely still, absorbed in the raw honesty of his performance. Several people were crying openly. This wasn't just Ethan's story. It was the story of anyone who had ever felt unseen by someone they loved. So I come here, to this place where words have power, where teenagers know that truth is the only currency that matters, where I can remember that I am more than someone's disappointment, more than evidence of settling, more than a man not quite good enough. For the woman who used to love him. As the poem reached its climax, Clara felt something fundamental shift inside her chest. This was what she'd been missing. Not just Ethan's talent or passion, but his deep capacity for insight, for compassion, for turning pain into art that could heal both himself and others. And maybe someday she'll remember. That love isn't about upgrading. That partnership isn't performance. That the man who makes her coffee every morning and believes in her dreams, even when she's forgotten his, might be worth a second look. The poem ended with Ethan's voice barely above a whisper, the silence that followed more powerful than any applause. Then the room erupted, not just clapping, but the kind of standing ovation reserved for truth that cuts so deep it changes something in everyone who hears it. Clara sat in the taxi, devastated and transformed. She understood now why he came here, why he needed this space where he could be seen and valued for who he really was. She understood that while she'd been networking her way into Manhattan society, he'd been building something infinitely more meaningful, a community where broken people could find their voices and remember their worth. Most painfully, she understood that she'd become exactly the kind of person she'd once promised herself she'd never be. Someone so focused on appearances that she'd lost sight of substance, so busy climbing that she'd forgotten what she was climbing toward. As the evening concluded and people began filing out of the community center, Clara made a decision that terrified her more than anything she'd ever done. She opened the taxi door. "Wait for me," she told Marcus. "This might take a while." "Take all the time you need, honey," he said with a knowing smile. "Some conversation's been waiting long enough." Clara stepped onto the Brooklyn sidewalk, her expensive heels clicking against concrete as she walked toward the community center, toward her husband, toward the conversation that would either destroy their marriage or save it. She didn't know which outcome scared her more. Clara's hand trembled as she reached for the community center's door handle. Through the glass, she could see people milling around, congratulating performers and saying their goodbyes. The warm light spilled onto the sidewalk, and she could hear the gentle murmur of voices, laughter, and the kind of genuine conversation that happened when people had just shared something real together. She'd been standing there for 10 minutes, paralyzed by the magnitude of what she was about to do. Walking through that door meant admitting everything. That she'd been following him, that she'd been living a lie, that she'd somehow managed to marry an extraordinary man while convincing herself he was ordinary. A young woman emerged from the building, the same teenager Clara had watched perform earlier in the week. She had natural hair and intricate braids and eyes that held too much wisdom for someone so young. "You coming in?" the girl asked, holding the door open. "We got some snacks left if you're hungry." Clara's throat felt dry as sandpaper. I'm not sure I belong in there." The teenager studied her for a moment, taking in Clara's expensive coat and obvious nervousness. "You here for somebody specific, or just curious about what we do?" "My husband," Clara managed. "He performs here. Ethan Rodriguez." The girl's face lit up immediately. "Mr. E? Oh man, you're Clara. He talks about you all the time." Her expression grew more thoughtful, though he seemed pretty sad when he did that piece tonight. "That was about you, wasn't it?" The direct question hit Clara like a slap. She nodded, unable to speak. "Look," the teenager said, her voice surprisingly gentle. "I don't know what your situation is, but Mr. E is good people. Like, really good people. He helped me find my voice when I thought I didn't have nothing worth saying. He helped my brother get into community college when everyone else had given up on him. He sees stuff in people that they don't even see in themselves." She paused, studying Clara with those two wise eyes. "Maybe the question ain't whether you belong in there. Maybe it's whether you're ready to see what you've been missing." Before Clara could respond, the door opened again and Ethan emerged, his jacket slung over his shoulder and a small notebook tucked under his arm. He was talking to an older man about scheduling something for next week, completely absorbed in the conversation. Then he looked up and saw her. The world seemed to stop. Every sound faded into background noise as Ethan's eyes locked with Clara's across the few feet of sidewalk that separated them. His face went through a series of expressions: surprise, confusion, hurt, and something that might have been hope before settling into careful neutrality. "Clara." His voice was barely audible. "What are you doing here?" The teenager looked between them and quietly slipped back inside, giving them privacy for whatever was about to happen. Clara opened her mouth, but no words came out. "How do you explain that you've been watching your husband secretly for 4 days? How do you admit that you've just discovered he's been living an entire meaningful life that you knew nothing about? How do you apologize for becoming someone you don't recognize?" "I followed you," she whispered finally. "That first night, when you left wearing different clothes. I don't know what I thought, but I followed you." Ethan's expression didn't change, but she saw something flicker in his eyes. "How long?" "4 nights. I've been sitting in a taxi across the street, watching you through the window." "Watching me?" The words weren't a question, but Clara nodded anyway. "I heard your poem tonight." About me." Ethan looked away, his jaw tightening. "I didn't know you were out there." "I know. I'm sorry. I should have." "Should have what, Clara?" His voice was quiet, but sharp with pain. "Should have come inside? Should have asked me directly what I was doing? Should have trusted me enough to tell you the truth if you were curious about my life?" Each question hit like a physical blow because they were all fair. She should have done all of those things, but instead she'd chosen suspicion and secrecy, the same way she'd chosen distance and criticism for months without even realizing it. "Yes," she said simply. "I should have done all of that." People were beginning to emerge from the community center, saying goodbyes and making plans for next week. Several of them called out to Ethan, thanking him for the evening, complimenting his performance. He responded with genuine warmth, but Clara could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he kept glancing at her as if she might disappear. "We should talk," he said finally, once the sidewalk had mostly cleared. "But not here." "Okay. Where?" "There's a diner around the corner. It's nothing fancy, but—" "I don't care about fancy," Clara interrupted, and realized with a shock that she meant it. After 4 nights of watching her husband in this neighborhood, surrounded by people who valued authenticity over appearance, the word fancy felt hollow and meaningless. They walked in silence to the diner, a classic 24-hour place with red vinyl booths and fluorescent lighting that had probably looked exactly the same for 30 years. It was the opposite of every restaurant Clara had been to in the past 6 months. No marble countertops, no artisanal anything, no carefully curated atmosphere designed to impress. It felt more real than anywhere she'd been in years. They slid into a booth near the back, and a waitress with kind eyes and tired feet brought them coffee without being asked. Clara wrapped her hands around the white, ceramic mug, grateful for something to do with her nervous energy. "So," Ethan said finally. 4 nights. 4 nights, Clara confirmed. "What did you think you were going to find?" The question was loaded with hurt, and Clara couldn't blame him. "Honestly, I thought I was going to find you cheating on me." Ethan's eyebrows rose. "Cheating? You were dressing differently, acting different, being secretive about where you were going. What was I supposed to think?" "You were supposed to trust me," he said quietly. "Or, if you couldn't do that, you were supposed to ask me directly what was going on." He was right, and they both knew it. Clara took a sip of coffee, buying time to figure out how to explain the unexplainable. "I haven't been a very good wife lately, have I? I don't want to have this conversation to make you feel guilty, Clara. I want to have it because I need to understand what happened to us." The pain in his voice was raw and immediate. Clara had heard him perform that poem about feeling invisible, but hearing him speak about it directly, to her, was somehow worse. This wasn't art anymore. This was her marriage falling apart in real time. "I don't know what happened," she whispered. "I really don't. Somewhere along the way, I started thinking that loving you meant settling for less than I deserved. And I hate that I thought that. I hate that I became that person." Ethan was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee. "When did I become not enough for you?" The question broke her heart because she could see that he genuinely wanted to understand, even though asking it was clearly killing him. "You were never not enough," Clara said, her voice cracking. "I was the one who wasn't enough. I was so insecure about whether I belonged in the world I was trying to break into that I started believing you were the reason I didn't fit in. But you do fit in with those people. I've watched you at those events. You're brilliant. You're talented. You command respect. You don't need me to be different for you to succeed." "I know that now," Clara said. "But at the time, it felt easier to blame you for my own fears than to face the fact that maybe I didn't actually want to belong somewhere that required me to be ashamed of the person I love most." The words hung between them, more honest than anything Clara had said in months. She watched Ethan process them, saw the way his shoulders relaxed slightly even as his eyes remained guarded. "The community center," she said, changing direction slightly. "How long have you been going there?" 3 years, he said. "I started volunteering right after that dinner party at the Hendersons, where you introduced me as your husband, who teaches, and then spent the entire evening apologizing for my career to people who weren't listening anyway." Clara remembered that night. She remembered the way Ethan had grown quieter as the evening went on, the way he'd barely spoken during the ride home. She'd been too focused on analyzing her own performance to notice his pain. "I needed somewhere I could be useful," he continued. "Somewhere my work mattered to people who weren't embarrassed by what I do for a living." "Ethan, let me finish," he said, not unkindly. "I found this place, and these kids, and this community of people who understand that words have power, that stories matter, that teaching and mentoring and helping people find their voices is actually meaningful work." He paused, meeting her eyes directly. "I found a place where I could remember who I used to be before I started seeing myself through your eyes." The accusation was gentle but devastating. Clara realized that somewhere along the way, she'd made her husband feel the way those gallery people had made her feel, like he wasn't quite good enough, like he needed to apologize for taking up space. "I watched you tonight," she said quietly. "I watched you with those kids, with that whole room full of people. You were, God, Ethan, you were magnetic. You were everything I always knew you were, but somehow forgot to see. You stopped seeing me a long time ago," he said. "I became invisible in my own home." The truth of it hit her like a physical blow. "I know, and I don't know how to fix that, but I want to try." Ethan leaned back in the booth, studying her face. "What do you want, Clara? Really want? Because I can't keep being married to someone who's constantly disappointed that I'm not someone else." It was the question she'd been avoiding for months, maybe years. What did she want? The successful career, the impressive social circle, the beautiful apartment. She had all of that. But sitting in this diner, looking at her husband across a table scarred with years of use, Clara realized that none of it meant anything if she had to give up the best part of herself to get it. "I want to know you again," she said. "I want to remember why I fell in love with you. I want to figure out how to be proud of what you do instead of ashamed of what you don't do. I want to stop performing my life and start living it." "And what about your career? Your social circle? All the things that were so important that you couldn't have me interfering with them?" Clara thought about the past 4 nights, watching Ethan work with those teenagers, seeing the way he helped people find their voices and believe in their worth. She thought about the standing ovation he'd received for a poem that had taken more courage to write and perform than anything she'd ever done. "I want to find a way to build something that matters as much as what you've built," she said. "I want to stop chasing other people's approval and start doing work that actually helps people." Ethan was quiet for a long time, and Clara could see him weighing her words against months of disappointment and hurt. Finally, he spoke. "I wrote that poem 3 weeks ago," he said. "I've been performing pieces about us, about missing you, about feeling invisible, for months. Tonight was the first time I used your name." "Why tonight?" "Because I was getting ready to give up," he said simply. "I couldn't keep loving someone who didn't love me back. It was killing me." The words hit Clara like ice water. She'd been so focused on her own dissatisfaction that she'd never considered that Ethan might reach his breaking point too. "Are you giving up?" she whispered. Ethan looked at her for a long moment, and Clara held her breath, suddenly understanding that her entire future was balanced on his answer. "I don't know," he said finally. "I don't know if we can find our way back to each other." It wasn't the answer she'd hoped for, but it wasn't a definitive no. It was honest, which was more than she'd been with him in months. "Can I try?" she asked. "Can I come back tomorrow night and meet the people whose lives you're changing? Can I learn about this part of you that I never knew existed? Can I figure out how to be the kind of person who deserves to be married to someone like you?" Ethan's eyes filled with tears he didn't let fall. "You always deserve to be married to me, Clara. You just stopped believing it." The truth of that statement settled between them like a bridge, fragile, but there. Clara reached across the table and touched his hand, the first intentional physical contact they'd had in weeks. "I want to believe it again," she whispered. "Will you help me remember how?" Ethan looked down at their joined hands, then back up at her face. She could see him making a decision, choosing hope over self-protection. "Okay," he said quietly. "But Clara, this has to be real. I can't go through this again. If you're not sure, if you think you might change your mind when things get comfortable again, please just tell me now." "I'm sure," Clara said, and realized that for the first time in months, she was telling the absolute truth. "I want to fight for us. I want to fight for you." Outside the diner windows, Brooklyn hummed with late-night energy. Inside their booth, Clara and Ethan began the slow, difficult work of finding their way back to each other. It would take time and patience and a willingness to see themselves clearly. But for the first time in longer than either could remember, it felt possible. The hardest part wasn't over yet, but they were finally ready to begin. 6 months later, Clara stood in the same community center where her world had cracked open, but everything was different now. The walls that had once seemed foreign and intimidating now felt like home. The faces that had been strangers were now friends. People who knew her story, who had watched her stumble through her own journey of rediscovery with the same patience they'd once shown frightened teenagers finding their voices for the first time. "You ready for this?" asked Keisha, the same teenager who had held the door open for Clara that first terrifying night. She was 18 now, preparing for college in the fall, but she still came to the center every week to mentor younger kids. Her poetry had grown bolder, more confident, and Clara had watched her transformation with the same awe she'd once felt watching Ethan work his quiet magic. Clara looked down at the notebook in her hands, pages filled with her own handwriting, words that had poured out of her over the past months as she'd learned to see her life clearly for the first time. Tonight was her first time performing, her first time sharing her own story with the community that had become her unexpected sanctuary. "I'm terrified," Clara admitted, her voice shaking slightly. "Good," Keisha grinned. "That means it matters." The center was packed tonight, not just with the regular weekly attendees, but with family and friends who had come to support a special showcase called Transformations. The theme was stories of change, of growth, of people who had become different versions of themselves through the power of community and truth-telling. Clara had never imagined she'd be part of something like this. 6 months ago, she'd been networking her way through Manhattan galleries, collecting business cards and compliments while feeling increasingly empty inside. Now she spent her Tuesday evenings here, her Saturdays volunteering at a literacy program in Harlem, and her Sundays working with Ethan to plan community workshops that brought together his teaching expertise and her design skills to help families create beautiful, functional spaces on limited budgets. Her business had changed too. She'd kept some of her high-end clients, the ones who valued her work rather than her social connections. But she'd also started taking on projects for community organizations, schools, and families who had never been able to afford professional design help before. The work paid less, but meant more, and she discovered that there was something deeply satisfying about using her talents to solve real problems for real people. 5 minutes, Ethan called out, and Clara felt her stomach flip with nerves. He caught her eye across the room and gave her the same encouraging smile he'd been offering for 6 months, patient, supportive, proud of every small step she'd taken toward becoming the person she was meant to be. Their marriage hadn't magically healed overnight. There had been difficult conversations, therapy sessions, moments when they'd both wondered if the damage was too deep to repair. But they'd done the work, slow, careful work of learning to see each other clearly again, of rebuilding trust and intimacy and genuine partnership. Clara had moved out of their penthouse apartment 3 months ago, not because they were separating, but because they both realized that marble towers and expensive views weren't what made a home. They'd found a smaller place in Brooklyn, closer to the community center, with good light and enough space for Ethan's books and Clara's design materials. It was one-tenth the size of their old place, but it felt like a real home in a way the penthouse never had. Clara Martinez Rodriguez, Ethan announced, and Clara felt a flutter of warmth at hearing their hyphenated name. She'd started using it again after realizing that she'd dropped the Rodriguez without even thinking about it. Another small way she'd been unconsciously distancing herself from the man she loved. She walked to the microphone on unsteady legs, looking out at the familiar faces in the audience. There was Marcus, her former taxi driver, who had become an unexpected friend and whose own poetry about 30 years of driving New York City streets had moved her to tears. There was Mrs. Chun from the corner bodega, who had started coming to the center after Clara had convinced her that her stories of immigrating from Taiwan were worth sharing. There were teenagers and teachers and social workers and artists and people who had found each other in this space where truth was the only currency that mattered. And there was Ethan, sitting in the front row where she could see him clearly, his eyes full of love and encouragement and pride. Clara opened her notebook and began to read. I used to collect beautiful things, art and furniture and connections that glittered, like fool's gold in the harsh light of morning. I built a tower of marble and crystal, climbed high enough to look down on the world, but forgot that looking down means you can't see what's right beside you. The poem continued, chronicling her journey from the woman who had been ashamed of her husband's teaching career to the woman who now understood that education was revolution, that helping people find their voices was the most important work anyone could do. I followed him one night, expecting betrayal, finding instead a man so beautiful. I had forgotten how to see him. He was teaching children to fly, while I was learning to fall gracefully, from heights that had never been worth climbing. She wrote about the community center, about discovering that belonging wasn't something you bought or networked your way into, but something you earned by showing up authentically, by being useful, by caring about something bigger than yourself. Now I know that love isn't about upgrading, that partnership isn't performance, that the man who makes coffee with careful hands and believes in dreams I'd forgotten I had is not a limitation but a liberation from the prison of my own small ambitions. The poem concluded with Clara's realization that transformation wasn't about becoming someone new, but about remembering who she'd always been underneath the layers of insecurity and striving. I am learning to love ordinary magic, the way he laughs at his own jokes, the way teenagers trust him with their secrets, the way community grows in small moments, of people choosing to see each other clearly. I am learning that being enough is more than enough. That home isn't a place you buy, but a feeling you build, one honest conversation at a time. As Clara finished, the room erupted in applause, but more importantly, she saw understanding in the faces around her. These people knew what it meant to struggle with identity, to lose yourself in other people's expectations, to find your way back to authenticity through community and courage. She stepped away from the microphone and walked directly to Ethan, who stood to meet her with tears in his eyes. I'm proud of you, he whispered, pulling her into his arms. I'm proud of us, she whispered back. Later that evening, as they walked home through their Brooklyn neighborhood, Clara reflected on how different this felt from those long-ago nights when they'd ridden in silence through Manhattan after gallery openings and networking events. Now they talked, really talked, about their days, their dreams, their plans for the community workshop they were launching next month. Do you ever miss it? Ethan asked as they paused at a red light. The old life, I mean. The penthouse, the gallery openings, all of that. Clara considered the question seriously. I miss some of the work, she said honestly. I love the creative challenges, and there are parts of that world that were genuinely fulfilling. But I don't miss the person I was becoming in that world. I don't miss feeling like I had to choose between loving you and loving myself. They'd reached their building, a converted brownstone with a small garden where their neighbors grew vegetables and children played after school. It wasn't impressive by Manhattan standards, but it was real in a way their marble tower had never been. What about you? Clara asked as they climbed the stairs to their second-floor apartment. Do you ever wish I hadn't followed you that night? That we just let things continue the way they were? Ethan paused with his key in the lock, turning to look at her seriously. Never, he said. Even when it was hard, even when we weren't sure we'd make it through, I never wished you hadn't followed me. Because this, he gestured between them, around them, at the life they'd built together, This is what I always hoped we could have. Inside their apartment, they settled into their evening routine, different from the old days when they'd moved around each other like polite strangers, but comfortable in its own new way. Clara made tea while Ethan graded papers at their kitchen table. They talked about the teenagers who had performed that night, about the workshop they were planning, about the small daily miracles of a life lived in genuine partnership. As they got ready for bed, Clara caught sight of herself in their bedroom mirror. She looked different than she had 6 months ago, not because of her clothes or her hair or her makeup, but because of something in her eyes. She looked like someone who knew herself, someone who was proud of the life she was building rather than ashamed of what she lacked. "I love you," she said to Ethan as they settled into bed. Words that had become meaningful again because they were chosen rather than automatic. "I love you too," he replied, and Clara could hear in his voice that he meant all of her. Not just the successful designer or the supportive wife, but the woman who was still learning, still growing, still figuring out how to be the best version of herself. Outside their window, Brooklyn hummed with the energy of millions of people trying to build good lives for themselves and their families. Inside their small apartment, Clara and Ethan fell asleep as they had every night for the past 6 months, as partners, as friends, as two people who had found their way back to each other by learning to see clearly in the dark. The story could have ended 6 months ago in that diner, with promises and good intentions. But real transformation doesn't happen in a single conversation or a moment of recognition. It happens in the daily choice to show up authentically, to do the hard work of change, to build something meaningful with whatever gifts you've been given. Clara had thought she was too good for her husband until she followed him one night and discovered that the question wasn't whether she was too good for him, but whether she was good enough for herself. The answer, she had learned, was always yes, but only if she was brave enough to do the work of becoming who she really was. And that work, the most important work of her life, was just beginning. If you made it to the end, please like the video and subscribe to our channel. It truly means the world to us. See you in the next one.